This video is sponsored by War Thunder. The First World War is almost always thought of as a war against Germany and to a lesser extent Austria-Hungary. It's easy to forget that there was a third empire that participated on their side, the Ottoman Empire. That is because, by that point in its life, the Ottoman Empire was on its last legs and wasn't able to contribute much to the war effort. In fact, their military performance on the battlefield was extremely poor. The Ottoman military was outdated, poorly equipped, and poorly led. In one battle, tens of thousands of Ottoman troops ended up freezing to death because they hadn't been given the winter clothing that they needed. The war would turn out to be a disaster for the Ottomans. They lost a huge amount of territory, and after the war was over, they would see their empire taken apart by the victors. So, why was the Ottoman military so ineffective in World War I? Why couldn't the once mighty empire take advantage of its strategic position between the Balkans and the Middle East to help its allies win the war? In this video, I'm going to answer all those questions. But first, let's have an overview of how it happened. The story of the Ottoman Empire in World War I. In June of 1914, Europe was at peace and war didn't seem to be on the horizon. In fact, the continent was at the height of its power. The past century had been relatively peaceful, allowing for levels of prosperity and technological progress never before seen in human history. There were tensions between the nations, but they had just about been kept in check. Then, on the 28th of June, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. That act of terrorism would end up triggering an astonishing escalation into what would become the biggest war the world had ever seen. Germany and Austria-Hungary would find themselves fighting the combined forces of Britain, France, and Russia. The Ottomans didn't actually enter the war for some time after it began. The European powers were all at war with each other by August the 4th, but the Ottomans didn't enter the war until the 31st of October, almost 3 months later. Initially, it wasn't even clear which side they would be on. Until 1914, the Ottoman Empire had actually had pretty good relations with Britain and France. In fact, they'd even ordered 2 large battleships from Britain, which were fully paid for. Ironically, it was actually that deal that was one of the reasons that the Ottomans ended up siding against Britain. When the war broke out in August, the British were already suspicious of the Ottomans. That was because the year before, the Ottoman government had asked Germany to send military advisors to help them reorganize their army. Fearing that the Ottomans might be about to ally with the Germans, the British refused to deliver the ships that the Ottomans had ordered and didn't give them a refund. That seizure was a huge blow to the Ottoman government's prestige and finances. It also badly strained relations with Britain. Then, a few days later, the Ottomans gave 2 German ships refuge from the British Navy in Ottoman waters. The Ottoman government didn't actually want that to get them involved in the war. Initially, they tried to downplay the situation, saying that it was a temporary arrangement rather than a formal alliance with Germany. At the same time, they tried to negotiate with both the Allies and the Central Powers to try to maintain neutrality. Those negotiations ultimately failed, and they ended up entering the war on the side of Germany and Austria. Now, to understand the situation that the Ottomans were in, we need to take a closer look at the geography of their empire and the fronts that they had to defend. The first front was the Balkans, where the priority was protecting Istanbul, the empire's capital. The second was the Caucasus Mountains, where the Ottoman Empire shared a large border with Russia. That front actually became one of the most active of the entire war, with large amounts of territory regularly changing hands. The biggest challenge would be to defend their territory in the Middle East. There they would have to defend against British forces invading from numerous directions, including Egypt and modern-day Iraq and Yemen. In total, the Ottomans had to defend 12,000 kilometers of borders and coastlines, spanning the Black Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, and the Mediterranean. It was an immense challenge, and even more so for an empire so weak that it was known as the sick man of Europe. As soon as the fighting started, it didn't go well. The British and French imposed a naval blockade along the Ottoman coastline and began bombarding strategic ports on the Black Sea and Mediterranean. Then the British launched an attack on the Persian Gulf and quickly took the port of Basra. That secured them an important outpost in Iraq, which would be a crucial region throughout the war. At the same time, the Ottomans faced an invasion from Russia in the Caucasus. Initially, they managed to hold their ground against the Russian advance. However, they then tried to counterattack, and that turned into a disaster. At the Battle of Sarai Kamish, an Ottoman army of roughly 100,000 men tried to encircle the invading Russian forces. It was totally overambitious, far beyond the scope of the Ottoman military. In the end, the entire force was decimated, with over 80% of the men either killed, injured, or captured. Meanwhile, in Palestine and Egypt, the Ottomans actually went on the offensive. They tried to seize the strategically vital Suez Canal from the British, but the campaign was poorly planned and ended in utter failure. Within 2 months of entering the war, the Ottomans were losing on all fronts. Britain, France, and Russia took that as a signal that they might be about to collapse very fast and decided to strike at the empire's heart, Istanbul. Vulnerable from the blockade and with outdated fortifications, Istanbul seemed like an achievable target. That led to the Gallipoli campaign, one of the most infamous battles of the war. The Gallipoli campaign started in early 1915 when the Allies launched a naval assault on the Dardanelles Strait, hoping to force their way to Istanbul. However, the Ottoman mines and artillery inflicted heavy losses, forcing the Allies to abandon their ships and switch to a land invasion. On April the 25th, Allied troops landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula, expecting a swift victory. Instead, they encountered fierce Ottoman resistance, and the campaign devolved into grueling trench warfare. The fight became a bloody stalemate, with immense losses on both sides. Eventually, after about 8 months, the Allies decided to withdraw. For the Ottomans, Gallipoli was a huge victory and a massive boost to morale. However, the triumph had come at a cost, as the military was extremely strained from fighting on so many fronts. In 1915, nearly 100% of the Ottoman army was in active combat. It had lost about 500,000 men, and so from that point on, it was virtually impossible for the Ottomans to launch any offensives. By 1916, the tide had fully turned against them, and they suffered defeat after defeat. The first front to collapse was against the Russians in the Caucasus. On February the 15th, the Russians captured the key fortress of Erzurum, which had been crucial to the Ottomans maintaining their position in the region. With Erzurum lost, there was nothing to stop the Russian advance, and several other major cities fell in quick succession. Russian forces were now deep in the Ottoman heartland. Those defeats led the Ottoman government to commit one of the worst atrocities done by any country in the entire war, the Armenian genocide. I will talk more about that horrific event later, but basically Istanbul accused the Armenians of supporting the Russians and had them killed en masse. At the same time, the Ottomans faced serious problems in the Middle East. They were challenged not only by outside enemies, but also from rebellions within. The biggest rebellion was the Arab Revolt, which happened because many Arabs were unhappy with Ottoman rule and wanted independence. In June of 1916, Sheriff Hussein of Mecca, an important Arab leader, openly opposed the Ottomans and called for independence. The British saw in the revolt an opportunity to weaken the Ottomans. They promised to support the Arabs and hinted at granting them independence if they joined their side in the war. A key figure in that was T.E. Lawrence, also known as Lawrence of Arabia. He worked to bring different Arab groups together and organized guerrilla warfare against the Ottomans. For the already struggling Ottomans, the entrance of the Arabs into the war was the last thing they needed. The war continued to go badly for them. In August of 1916, another attempt to seize the Suez Canal in Egypt ended in failure. British control of the canal wouldn't be challenged again throughout the war. By early 1917, a series of small but decisive battles had pushed the Ottomans back from the Sinai Peninsula, with the British forces reaching Gaza in March of 1917. The Ottomans fought hard and were able to defend Gaza for several months. Eventually, in November, the British heavily bombarded the ancient city and were able to capture it. That victory paved the way for the capture of Jerusalem, which fell just a few weeks later. The Ottomans had now been expelled from the last holy sites that they had controlled for about 4 centuries. However, 1917 did bring some good news for the Ottomans. In March, the Russian Tsar was forced to step down at the start of the Russian Revolution. For the next few months, Russia was embroiled in chaos, leading to it abandoning the Caucasus front. The Ottomans were able to quickly regain a lot of the territory that they had lost. However, those gains had little impact on the broader course of the war. In the south, British forces were still advancing, and by autumn of 1918, they were pushing deep into Syria. They would very soon be threatening the Turkish heartland itself. To make that push, the British relied on various vehicles to maintain their logistical and tactical mobility. Those vehicles were armed with machine guns that offered crucial firepower in tough terrain. Now, can you imagine yourself in command of an armored vehicle navigating the terrain and destroying your enemies? Thanks to today's sponsor, you can experience just that. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, now available for free on PC, consoles, and mobile devices. In War Thunder, you can take command of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships from 10 major nations, ranging from biplanes and armored cars from the 1920s to the fighter jets and main battle tanks of today. As a fan of military history, I appreciate the attention to detail of every vehicle. They are modeled down to their individual components: engines, fuel tanks, weapons, and crew, all susceptible to damage from enemy fire. These are not your average boxes with hit points. Also, different types of armor, shells, and missiles behave like their real-world counterparts. Pair that with realistic graphics and authentic sound effects, and you get an incredibly immersive combat experience. Join a worldwide community of over 70 million players in epic PvP battles today, and take part in the breathtaking experience that is War Thunder. There's simply no better game for fans of military history. War Thunder is available for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, and mobile. Use the links in the pinned comment to earn a limited time massive bonus pack. That is available for new players and returning players who haven't played in the last 6 months on PC and consoles. You'll get access to multiple premium vehicles, the exclusive vehicle decorator Eagle of Valor, 100,000 silver lions, and 7 days of premium account time. The offer is available for a limited time only, so be quick and sign up today. By late 1918, the Central Powers were collapsing, and it was clear that the war was lost. On September the 29th, 1918, Bulgaria surrendered, which severed the Ottoman Empire's supply lines with Germany and left Istanbul almost undefended. Eventually, on October the 30th, the Ottomans were forced to surrender. The defeat would spell the end for the empire, which was divided up by the victors. Even modern-day Turkey, the empire's heartland, was occupied. The once mighty empire was left as merely a rump state in the north. So, that is what happened, the total defeat and destruction of the Ottoman Empire. So is it really fair to say that they were useless? Did they really perform that badly? Well, to be fair, the Ottomans did actually perform better than many people were expecting when the war started. Many of the great powers, both allies and enemies, expected that they would collapse almost immediately. In reality, the Ottoman Empire did actually achieve a few respectable victories. It wasn't a total pushover. Their biggest victory was, of course, during the Gallipoli campaign, when they were able to badly humiliate the British. Another success was at the First Siege of Kut, where they were able to capture tens of thousands of British soldiers. That said, it's important to remember that they were fighting against enemies that were primarily focused on other theatres of the war. The British were pouring almost all of their resources into the war in France, while the Russians were focused on the fight against Germany and Austria-Hungary. If those two had prioritized the Ottoman front as much as the Ottomans did, the empire would probably have been knocked out within weeks. So why were the Ottomans so much weaker than the other powers in World War I? Well, the first thing to mention is that the empire as a whole was far less advanced than some of the other European nations of the time. It was effectively stuck in the 1800s, having fallen far behind other nations in terms of industrialization and the adoption of new technologies. That can be most clearly seen from the fact that the empire still struggled with problems that other countries of Western Europe had largely overcome. A good example is a huge locust plague that happened in 1915. Swarms of locusts stripped areas around Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria of almost all of the vegetation. Crops were ravaged, and some regions had losses of up to 90%. That badly affected the already depleted food supply and led to widespread hunger. By December of 1915, the markets were empty and people had literally nothing to eat. One local diarist wrote, "I haven't seen darker days in all my life." The authorities were totally unable to deal with the problem. In Jerusalem, their solution was to force residents to collect 20 kilograms of locust eggs per week or face fines. That didn't work, and by 1916 there was a full-scale famine which killed up to 500,000 people. Another good example of the empire being stuck in the past is how slow it had been to industrialize. That becomes clear if we look at these two tables. The first shows coal production of each country, while the second is the length of railway that each country had laid. As you can see, in both cases, the Ottomans were a long way away from the other nations. It had laid only about 10% as much railway as France or Germany, even though it was 5 times the size in terms of territory. That severely hampered the war effort, particularly logistics. The lack of railways and a road network that was mostly dirt tracks meant that moving troops and supplies was agonizingly slow. From Istanbul, it took over a month to reach Syria and nearly 2 months to reach Iraq. On the Caucasus front, one of the key fortresses was Erzurum, but the railway network didn't reach all the way there, so troops had a 35-day march to get there from the end of the line. All that also meant that mobilization at the beginning of the war was incredibly slow, often taking 3 or 4 times longer than planned. The lack of industrialization also badly affected the Ottoman economy. Output per person in the Ottoman Empire was far lower than in industrial powerhouses like Britain or Germany. As a result, it could send a much smaller proportion of its men to fight. Over the course of the war, the Ottomans sent fewer than 3 million men to the front, or approximately 12% of their population. By comparison, Germany sent about 25% of its population. Another issue with the lack of industrial output is that the Ottoman military didn't have all the equipment that it needed. Field guns and artillery were outdated, while machine guns were almost totally non-existent. Each regiment was supposed to have 4 machine guns, but in reality it was a long way off even that basic standard. There was also a crippling shortage of ammunition, medical supplies, and even transport animals. In fact, the Germans actually wrote about how bad the situation was. In June of 1915, the head of the German mission reported that he finally had enough troops on hand, but was experiencing difficulty with artillery ammunition availability, especially for his field howitzers. The situation didn't get any better as the war went on. In 1917, one Ottoman commander wrote, "The army has no working artillery, no functioning machine guns, no aircraft, no commanding officers, no defensive lines, no reserves, no telephone. The troops are fighting in total isolation from each other, and their morale has collapsed. Indeed, the army has none of the things that it would need to win." So, the backwards, primitive nature of the Ottoman Empire was one big problem, but it was far from the only one. Another major issue is that the empire was incredibly internally divided. There was a lot of disunity, and some groups within it actually had very little loyalty. That was in part because the empire was very multi-ethnic. There were many different ethnic groups, and many of them didn't like living under Ottoman rule. The main ethnicity of the empire was the Turks, but they made up only about half of its population. The other half was made up of all sorts of groups, including Christians, Jews, Arabs, Kurds, Armenians, and Greeks. Those groups were deeply distrusted by the Ottoman authorities. In fact, Christians and Jews were so distrusted that they were given the option not to conscript for military service, but instead pay a fee. It would be easy to think that the Arabs and Kurds would be more loyal to the empire as they were Muslim, but that wasn't the case. In fact, probably the best example of a group not being loyal to the empire was, of course, the Arab Revolt. From the very start of the war, it was clear that the Arabs were not going to be loyal to the Ottomans. As the British invaded Iraq, they showed little interest in helping fight off the advance. Then, in May of 1915, less than a year into the war, the first city rose up in rebellion. The Ottomans used harsh measures to try to regain control of the area, but that just alienated the population even further. In fact, some came to view the invading British as preferable to the Ottomans and greeted them as liberators. By 1916, the Ottomans no longer held significant control over Iraq. However, that revolt in Iraq was just the beginning. In 1916, a similar uprising erupted on the Arabian Peninsula. It was organized by regional leaders of the holy cities Mecca and Medina, and supported by the British. The revolt began in June of 1916 in Mecca, but its roots can be traced back much further in time. There had long been discontent amongst the Arab population with Ottoman rule, and in fact there had been contact with the British and French even before the war started. The revolt came out of the failed Ottoman offensive in Egypt in February of 1915. The offensive failed in part because the local Arab tribes hadn't supported it, even though they had pledged to. The response of the Ottoman authorities was to arrest en masse Arab nationalist activists. The measures were extremely brutal, including public hangings and the exile of around 50,000 Arabs. That only alienated the Arab population further and fueled the rebellion. With British backing secured, the revolt quickly spread throughout the Western Arabian Peninsula with the goal of establishing an independent Arab state. The Arabs managed to secure several decisive victories, and with the help of the British, they were able to totally drive the Ottomans out of the region. Of course, the darkest example of the Ottomans' inability to deal with their multi-ethnic empire was the Armenian genocide. When the war started, the Armenians found themselves in an extremely precarious position as they lived both in Russia and the Ottoman Empire, with often vague borders between the regions. When the Russians invaded in 1914, the Ottomans were totally unable to resist the advance. They were totally routed and lost more than 60,000 men. The Ottoman army destroyed dozens of Armenian villages as they retreated and massacred their inhabitants. The Minister of War publicly blamed his defeat on the Armenians, who he claimed had actively sided with the Russians. That came to be believed by the Ottoman leadership, and they decided that the Armenians had to be eliminated to save the empire. Over the next 3 years, about 1.5 million Armenians were systematically killed by the Ottomans. Often they would be sent on death marches, forced to walk long distances in the Syrian desert until they died of exposure. Not only was it barbaric, it was also totally counterproductive to the Ottoman war effort. It led to the alienation of a large population that could have been conscripted to help the Ottoman defense. When the war started, there was actually a reasonable number of Armenian soldiers in the Ottoman ranks. Over time, the suspicion of those men grew to a frenzy, and they were shot by other Ottoman soldiers. The Armenians were the group most targeted by the Ottomans, but they certainly weren't the only ones. Similar atrocities happened on a smaller scale to other populations suspected of cooperating with the Russians. The Ottoman armies massacred about 350,000 Greeks and 250,000 Assyrians. Again, that was totally counterproductive to the war effort. Those populations became even more hostile to Ottoman rule and even more friendly towards its enemies. So, the Ottoman Empire was hampered by being stuck in the past and the fact that it was very internally divided. Those two issues were exacerbated by a third major issue that it faced: good old-fashioned military incompetence. A good example of that was the Caucasus campaign of December of 1914. The campaign started in the middle of winter in the Caucasus Mountains, and so it was extremely cold. Temperatures got down to minus 50 degrees, and there was up to 4 meters of snow. Such difficult terrain required excellent planning and preparation, and the Ottoman leadership failed at both. The Ottoman soldiers were given light uniforms without proper coats to protect them against the cold, and poor footwear. For food, they had only one ration: bread. The campaign went about as badly as you would imagine. Blizzards rendered many mountain paths impassable, slowing the advance. Visibility was so poor that many men got separated from their units. In the end, the Ottoman army was almost completely annihilated and lost more than 80,000 troops. While that disaster was in progress, the Ottomans were embarking on another suicidal offensive to try to take the Suez Canal from the British. That campaign was doomed to failure from the start for many reasons. It was to go through the Sinai Desert, which had no proper roads, few sources of water, and almost no vegetation. The logistics of providing food, water, and ammunition to an army crossing such inhospitable terrain was always going to be difficult. Even if they made it all the way to the Suez Canal, they would be faced with a body of water hundreds of meters wide, 12 meters deep, and protected by British warships. Another problem was that the Ottomans didn't have nearly enough men for such an ambitious goal. They could deploy only about 50,000 troops, and many of them wouldn't be able to fight the British as they would be needed to man garrisons along the way. To fight them off, the British had 150,000 troops from various parts of their empire. As one would expect, the Ottoman offensive totally failed, and they were forced to withdraw. I think those are probably the biggest reasons that the Ottomans performed so badly in the war. Something else worth mentioning is that when World War I broke out, the Ottoman Empire was already exhausted from having just fought 3 large wars. In 1911, it fought a war with Italy over control of Libya. The war became a grueling guerrilla conflict and cost the Ottomans about 20,000 men. Eventually, the Ottomans were defeated and forced to give up control of Libya. Then, in 1912 and 13, the Ottomans were involved in the Balkan Wars. They were a disaster and cost the lives of about 1 million Ottoman civilians and left 500,000 displaced. In total, those wars cost the Ottoman Empire about 1/3 of its territory and 1/5 of its population. They also badly depleted the Ottoman military and left the empire totally bankrupt. The First World War broke out only 1 year later, and as you can see, the Ottoman Empire was in no position to get involved. All that begs the question, if it was so obvious that getting involved in the war was going to be a disaster for them, why did they? Why didn't they just sit it out and focus on trying to prop up their decrepit empire? Well, really, they got involved in large part by accident. In fact, it was actually a bit of a farce. As I mentioned earlier, before the war, the Ottoman Empire had good relationships with Britain and France, but also with Germany. However, at the same time, it had very bad relationships with their respective allies. It had long been enemies with Russia, the ally of Britain and France, and Austria-Hungary, the ally of Germany. Both of them had been rivals for centuries and had conflicting claims over territories. Now, in the years before the war, the Ottoman Empire was ruled by 3 men, the Grand Vizier, the Minister of War, and the Minister of the Navy. The Ottomans' chaotic entrance into the war was in large part because those 3 men were split over which side they wanted to be on. The Grand Vizier and the War Minister wanted to ally with Germany. The Minister of the Navy wanted to ally with Britain and France, hoping that they would be able to restrain Russia's aggression. In fact, on the 18th of July 1914, just days before the war started, the Minister of the Navy went to Paris to discuss the possibility of allying with them. The talks failed, and the French made clear to him that they wouldn't protect the Ottomans from Russia. Just 2 weeks later, relations worsened further when Britain refused to deliver the 2 ships that the Ottomans had already paid for. Throughout September and October, the Grand Vizier and the Minister of the Navy did their best to try to stay out of the war. All the while, the Minister of War was pushing to enter the conflict on the side of the Germans. He would eventually get his wish, and they entered the war at the end of October. Given that the Ottomans were in such a bad position before the war started, it's easy to wonder why the Germans even wanted them as an ally. In fact, the German ambassador actually believed that the Ottomans would be more of a liability than an asset. On the 18th of July, he wrote, "Turkey is today, without any question, still worthless as an ally. She would be only a burden to her associates and not able to offer them the slightest advantage." That did turn out to be basically true. Having the Ottomans on their side turned out to be extremely expensive for the Germans. In exchange for getting involved in the war, the Ottoman government demanded £5 million worth of gold. Over the course of the war, Germany supplied about £29 million worth of arms and ammunition. The Germans also contributed to the construction of fortifications at the Dardanelles, which played a key role in defending against British invasion. Given all that, you might be surprised to learn that the Germans actually really wanted the Ottomans as an ally. That was because they thought they would be an asset as the leaders of the Islamic world. What they really hoped for was that a call for jihad would stir unrest among Muslim populations under the control of Britain, France, and Russia. Britain ruled over millions of Muslims in India. Russia had significant Muslim communities in Central Asia, and France governed a large Muslim population in North Africa. The Germans hoped that a call for jihad would trigger revolts in those regions. There was actually some merit to that idea. In fact, in 1916, there was a Muslim revolt against the Russians in Central Asia. That forced the Russians to divert military resources away from the Eastern Front against Germany and Austria-Hungary. That said, the revolt wasn't primarily because of the Ottomans' call for jihad, as much as it was about how the Russians treated the populations there. People were angry about land seizures, economic exploitation, and cultural repression. The final trigger for the revolt was actually a conscription decree in 1916 that would have sent men from Central Asia to fight in Europe. Ultimately, even the small benefit that the Germans hoped to get from having the Ottomans on their side didn't really materialize. Overall, there are numerous reasons why the Ottomans performed so badly in World War I. Their empire was on its last legs. It really did deserve the nickname, the sick man of Europe. When the war started, everyone thought that they were in no position to fight, and unfortunately for the Ottomans, that turned out to be correct. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring today's video. Make sure to check out War Thunder now for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, or on mobile, and use my links in the pinned comment or video description to register. Those of you who are new or who haven't played in 6 months will also receive a massive bonus pack across PC and console, including multiple premium vehicles, in-game currency, and more.